Okay. Good morning. Good morning. If we can find our seats, please. Robert. Hello. It's an enthusiastic crowd today. All right. So, in the process of studying this lesson, I found a quote that I thought was a quote from sort of secular realm that I thought was kind of apropos. It says, it was a definition of tariff. It says, a scale of taxes on imports designed to protect the domestic producer from the greed of his consumer. And that was said by Ambrose Bierce, who lived from 1842 to 1914. So some things just never change. All right. So today we're going to continue in what will be the last of the 10 commandments that are repeated in the New Testament, the 9 that are repeated in the New Testament. So next week we'll be kind of out of our mold that we've been using for all of these past 10 weeks and into new territory. So that'll be an interesting adventure. But let's all look at Exodus 20, verse 17. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. So what we're looking at here is God making a prohibition against basically desiring or wanting the things that belong to other people, right? And you know, covet is a word that we maybe don't use this in the same way. There may have been a little bit of a shift because I think we sometimes say, well, we covet your prayers or whatever. So the connotation of covet and covetousness may have moved a little bit. Not saying it's moved a great deal, but there may have been kind of a trimming of the edges of this word over time. But it is synonymous with greed, right? It's maybe greed is a broader term, and covetousness is a little more focused on the of others portion of that definition, right? So, what distinguishes one greed from covetousness, I guess, is how that thing that you're desiring is owned or who has it, right? So it's pretty clear that this is not just a simple interest, right? Like in having something. So you went over to your neighbor's house and you saw their new toy or whatever, and you said, hey, that's really cool. And so you go home and get online and order it for yourself. That's not what we're talking about here, right? Covetousness is an unhealthy, obsessive desire for something, right? This is a fixation in your mind about something, in particular, something that belongs to someone else, right? At least for me, maybe you guys are better English scholars and have better vocabulary than I do, but for me, it wasn't entirely clear what's the difference between covetousness and envy. Does anybody want to take a crack at that before we reveal it? What's the difference between covetousness and envy? Rocky?
The word there really means desire, because that particular word is used in other verses. Like in Isaiah chapter 53, it's talking about Jesus, how he would have to desire him. That's the same word that's used there. And then in Genesis, where Eve was tempted to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it says that fruit was desirable for knowledge. So what he's really condemning here is, you have to tell from the context, but he's condemning evil desires. So the word in itself, you have to tell from the context. It's like love and hate. I mean, it's not always right to love. It depends on what you love. Hate is not always wrong to hate. It depends on what you hate. And what he's doing here, he's condemning the wrong desires. Now, as you say, these are things that belong to other people, but it goes well beyond that. And in my mind, it really goes back to James chapter 2, where he's talking about the root of sin. I mean, James chapter 1, what did he say? Sin begins with a desire. When we're enticed by that desire and we act on it. So every one of these things that God has already condemned goes back to desire.
Yeah, so that's an important point.
Yeah.
Where are we in this list of things? Well, we've come to the end of the list of the things, and this is actually a bit of a root, right? So it's kind of going backwards, Dave.
To your question between covet and envy, at least the connotation to me, covet is more you want that specific thing, like your neighbor's wife. Whereas envy could be more of something that you couldn't really obtain, like you're envious of their position in life, you're envious of their health, something like that.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of digging in sort of psychological papers and things, and there's an element of class that comes into it. Like one of the examples was it wouldn't really be possible to envy the Queen of England. This was a little bit older paper because the person who was writing it was male and wasn't from that heritage, right? So it's there's an element of the capability or the possibility that's involved, but I think it's a little bit broader. Let's look at some of that, as I think it's important to know what we're talking about. So that it says, envy implies a malicious desire. Covetousness does not attack the possessor of the coveted thing. And kind of makes me think that the word I used in the notes is that covetousness is almost like a envy is almost like a metastasized form of covetousness, right? So you've gone from just simply desiring the thing to having an animosity towards the person who currently possesses the thing. And if we'll read a little bit more. And this is a little bit highbrow language. It says, the covetous person, unlike the envier, desires the object and is distressed over his unfulfilled desire that another has fulfilled. As such, the coveter is not necessarily distressed by the possessor of that something. The coveter, does not necessarily begrudge the possessor for possessing the desired thing, for the other is separated from the good possessed. And that's a guy named M.R. Kelly. So what he's basically saying is envy is all of those things it does do. Covetousness. So his paper was about envy, right? So kind of looking in the reverse at what he was saying. So what's the takeaway of all of that, right? Just basically means for me that just because you don't have some sort of negative feeling about the person who owns that KitchenAid device or that big TV, that doesn't mean you're not coveting. It means you're not envying. And I think it's probably an important note that you don't get to just slide by and say, well, I just want something, right? Just because you don't dislike the person who has it. So that was maybe a point that didn't need to be made, but anyway. Anybody have thoughts about that? So, yes, ma'am.
Makes me think of Jezebel and Ahab.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, Ahab wanted and he wouldn't sell it to him.
And what did he do?
He got sick.
He cried about it, right? Yeah.
And Jezebel, I'll fix it.
Yeah, so we talked about that last week, so I didn't really cover that in the examples, but I was going to allude to it because it's a pathetic example of the king weeping because he can't have a little piece of property to have what he, his little vineyard or whatever, right? So, yeah, it's pretty sad. I think it's interesting when you look at this commandment, right? So the last several weeks, we've been looking at these commandments and they're bang, bang, bang. Don't do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that, right? Very direct statements. This one to me, how I see that or how I hear this commandment is it's like a parent talking to a toddler, right? It says, shall not covet your neighbor's wife, his male servant, his female servant, his house, his ox, his donkey, whatever it is, don't covet it, right? It's just this list of things, and it's sad for us, I think, that God had to go to that extent, right? But I think he's making a point here by laying out very specific things and then making a blanket statement at the end, right? That this is an all-encompassing prohibition. Right, so.
I think he's establishing the context, because like I said, that word has a general meaning, it just means to desire. And you have to tell from the context whether it's right or wrong, because the word is used in other places in the Old Testament, and it's talking about perfectly good desire. So he's listing things that you should never, ever desire. And he's making it sinful. And I think, if we really pay attention to this, people often have this misconception, I think, that the Old Testament is just this list of rules, that you didn't have to have your heart in it, you could just follow it. That's not true. You had to have your heart in it, because he's addressing the heart here. Here's something that a person could have a desire for something that was wrong. Nobody would know about that except for that person and God, unless he starts to act on it. And that's what he's doing. He's prohibiting people from thinking, desiring the wrong things, because eventually they're going to act on it. And we see that over and over again.
Yeah, I understand your point about the word needing context, but if you look at the last clause, he says, or anything that's your neighbor's, right? So this could have been said as, thou shalt not desire anything that belongs to your neighbor, right? He could have made it like a bang statement, like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, right? He could have made it a shorter statement, but I think he's going on to be kind of pedantic almost with it, because we make excuses for ourselves. And this is probably the one that is the closest, right? Like murder is like a really far thing. Like, yeah, you've gone pretty far away when you get to that point, right? So I think he probably needed to pull this in and be very specific and give you some examples to guide your mind, right?
I think another way of looking at it is he's really tying that in to the previous prohibitions that he's already given, because he's basically saying this is the root cause of this. Because think about this. If you desire your neighbor's wife, what does that lead to?
Adultery.
Adultery, which he's already condemned.
Exactly.
If you desire his house, you desire his manservants, his female servants, you desire his field, what are you likely to do? Steal.
Yeah.
So it's prohibiting that. And in the worst case, you might have to kill him to be able to get it. And it goes even beyond that. I mean, it's all kinds of things that we desire. Like we know that why did the rulers deliver Jesus up to be crucified? Well, Matthew tells us that Pilate knew he did it because of envy. Well, they were jealous, they were covetous of their power, and they were losing their power to Jesus. So what did it do? It led to murder. So I think it really, if you really think about it, it really ties into things that are maybe more elaborated, more specifically in the New Testament, like James chapter 1. It's dealing with the root cause of sin. Don't desire to do things that are wrong, and that's a vast multitude of things.
Yeah, and so as we come to this final commandment, we've said all along, the root cause of this is greed. The root cause of that, greed, right? An inappropriate desire for whatever that thing was, like the adultery of David, right? That.
They looked and saw how the governments of other nations were, and what they do. We want a government like them. Give us a king.
Right.
They were being covetous of their neighbors. So again, they were desiring things that God didn't want them to desire.
Exactly.
And that's how we have to look at it.
Let's go with Jack first and then Mary.
David knew better when he looked at his neighbor's wife. He knew better, but he didn't recognize what was reality until the prophet came. Then he had no problem understanding it. So it's a blinding desire. It's so many people.
Right, and so that's having focused away from God, right? Like you've started looking at this thing, and maybe that's a root cause of what we're going to talk about next, is why would God have made this commandment, Mary?
When I think of covetousness, I think of things that people want, greed. I think of envy. It's the closest thing to jealousy. And all
Yeah.
of those are connected to the heart. Tony made a statement a couple of weeks ago about the heart is so wicked and how can we understand it? And the root of everything when it comes to our salvation is we can't see God without a pure heart. So when it comes to envy, covetousness, murder, whatever, it's all a matter of the heart.
Yeah. One slight twist, though. Covetousness and envy, they're not specific to materialistic things. Like Rocky said, they were looking at the king over there, and they wanted a king, so they you know what I mean? So it doesn't have to be like a material thing. But anyway, thank you, Mary. All right, so why do we think God made this commandment in the Old Testament? And I think right up front, this covetousness is a type of idolatry, right? Like you said, it takes your attention to do, and made me think about Jezebel and Ahab and Naboth. If we look in Micah 2, verse 1, it says, "Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is in the power of their hands. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They oppress a man in his house, a man in his inheritance," right? So it can lead to a social injustice, right? Especially when the people that have the authority to dispossess you of your things legally, right? All right, let's look in Joshua chapter 7, verse 19. And we'll look at the story of Achan very briefly, because I know it's been covered recently. It says, "Then Joshua said to Achan, 'My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel and praise to him, and tell me what you have done. Do not hide it from me.' And Achan answered Joshua, 'Truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, then I coveted them and took them. And see, they are hidden inside the earth, in the earth inside my tent, with the silver underneath.' So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and behold, it was hidden in his tent with the silver underneath. And they took them out of the tent and brought them to Joshua and to all the people of Israel, and they laid them down before the Lord. And Joshua and all Israel took Achan the son of Zerah, and the silver and the cloak and the bar of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, donkeys, and sheep, and his tent, and all that he had, and they brought them up to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, 'Why did you bring this trouble on us? And the Lord brings trouble on you today.' And all Israel stoned him with stones. They burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day." So you see here, one guy looks at something, has a desire for it, acts on it, right? Like Rocky said, this is the progression of sin. He sees it, he acts, and it ultimately leads to death. But not just his own death, right? It kind of very just tangentially covers the fact that his entire family is stoned, right, for this. So this has these kinds of sins have ripple effects through the community. And I think that's one of the reasons that you have this in the Old Testament. We've said it very regularly through this class, that this was the civil law, and we're dealing with the civic order of things. So when you have these kinds of activities that cause problems outside of just one or two people, it's got to be dealt with. So, comments on Achan or any of that?
I think it also pertains to the New Testament too, where the New Testament in Ephesians 4 it says, "Let the feast no longer scheme, but rather let it labor." So when you're eating something, it's sort of like, I want that, I want to work for it, so I'm going to take it, it you feed, But it's not the same thing that you see in television, you see it live. You say, I want like that. Then you work to find one.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier on, is it's not like you've gone to your neighbor's house and noticed that they have a really big TV and the football game looks really fantastic on it, so you go home and you buy one for yourself because you like the features of that. It's, I want that TV, that exact TV, right? Or that wife. Yeah, we covered that verse when we talked about thou shalt not steal, right? And just kind of bouncing ahead a little bit. What does the rest of that verse say? Don't stop stealing, but then do what? Labor to do, for why? Why do you labor? So that you can accumulate things to share with others, right? So let's just file that away. I didn't use that verse this week, but we're going to talk about some of that. Okay, so this is a really long reading. It's essentially 2 Kings chapter 5. I'm going to summarize. I always like to give you guys the context, but it's so long. Let's just kind of talk about what's going on here. So there's a commander of the Syrian army named Naaman. He's a leper. He goes and he talks to his king because one of the captives has said, hey, Naaman could get healed if he went back and saw Elisha. Yeah? And so the king sends to the king of Israel and says, hey, here's my commander. He's afflicted with leprosy, right? Like a huge problematic disease. And the king is like distressed because he can't heal leprosy, but Elisha comes in and says, hey, I can take care of this. The guy goes over, we know the story, he dips in the river, he becomes clean, and then he offers Elisha a whole lot of high-value materials, right? Elisha says, absolutely not, and sends him on his way. So then we find this guy Gehazi, and we'll pick up in verse 19 of 2 Kings 5, verse 19. He said to him, go in peace. But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, see, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, is all well? And he said, all is well. My master has sent me to say, there have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men, the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. He went in and stood before his master. So we're going to skip forward a little bit. So he went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, where have you been, Gehazi? And he said, your servant went nowhere. But he said to him, did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper like snow. So there's a few things to look at here. First of all, you can see that maybe because of the conflict between Syria and maybe not having a high opinion of Syrians, maybe that's why Gehazi was like, hey, he let him off easy, right? But you can see that he's decided that he is going to get something from Naaman. If Elisha's not smart enough to take it, he's going to get it, right? And then he turns into a liar, right? So this desire converts him from just somebody who has an obsession with this gold and silver and whatnot. It turns him into a liar because he lies to Naaman. And then when he gets home, I mean, your boss is a prophet, right? And you're going to try to pull the wool over his eyes. That doesn't seem like a well thought out plan. But anyway, he also lies to Elisha, right? And then he ends up, of course, being punished. I think it's interesting that if you look at verse 26, I don't think that vineyards and orchards and so forth were what was on offer from Naaman, because I think he was just carrying the gifts with him, right? But it's interesting to me that this kind of echoes the commandment, right? Especially where it says, verse 26, male servants and female servants, right? So I think I think Elisha is linking this back to the 10th commandment, right? What do you guys think about it? Before we're about ready to move to the New Testament, but is that a hand up? No? Okay. All right. So let's look in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, and we'll see where this commandment is, or at least one place where this commandment is reinstituted, if you will, in the New Testament. So Luke 12:15, and he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." So who's the speaker here? Jesus, right? Okay, so very authoritative, right? And now let us look at Matthew 26:14. It says, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him." And then if we look at Matthew 27:3, "Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, 'I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.' And they said, 'What is that to us? See to it yourself.' And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed. And when he went, he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the silver, said, 'It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is blood money.'" So there's a lot of stuff going on there, right? You have disloyalty to his friend, to this person that he's known for years and followed around. Judas is now choosing, I guess 30 pieces of silver was a substantial sum at the time, but you know, he's so greedy. We know that he stole from the treasury of the disciples, and so he clearly had an issue with that. But it's interesting, in his remorse, right? It leads to his death. But it also led his covetousness, his desire for that money, caused 2 deaths, right? Because basically he rats Jesus out, turns him over to the authorities, and he's crucified. Keaton.
Luke 12, just for a moment.
Sure.
I was reading through this earlier a couple weeks ago, and it occurred to me, and I asked a question, like, you know, covetousness and envy are so closely related, right? I mean, they definitely have nuance, but they overlap so much. And I wondered, you know, why did Jesus just highlight the coveting side and not envy? And to me, I think that kind of highlights one of the intrinsic differences and kind of how they almost are in parallel. I think to covet really is almost the gateway to envy.
Exactly.
I think you can covet without envy. I don't know that you can envy without covetousness. And I think that's why coveting is so much more talked about. I think it's probably why it's in Exodus 20 and not envy. And I think it's why Jesus talked about just that, because it's the recognition that if that happens,
you have to pass through covetousness
right,
to
have
get to envy.
enter there to get to envy.
So if we just cut it off here,
right,
problem
you can't
solved.
just fall backwards into envy. You know, and again, he's highlighting it's about the thing, right? And it doesn't have to be a material thing, but it is highlighted on something, whether it be a desire or a materialistic thing. Whereas envy, the way I always understood it was more of the malice, the
against the person who has the
right.
thing.
It almost departs from the thing now, and it's more of just I hate that they have it.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a distinct difference. It's nuanced, but it's different. And I think that's why Jesus only mentions that and not both of them together.
Yeah, and that's why I say it's almost like envy is a metastasized form of covetousness, right? It's just progressively worse. Yes, ma'am.
Just one thing I thought about the 30 pieces of silver here. Judas gets 30 pieces of silver for trading Jesus. In Exodus 21, 30 shekels of silver is the price of a servant. If a servant is killed by your ox, then you're supposed to give the person who owned that servant 30 shekels of silver. Jesus compared himself to a servant when he washed the disciples' feet. So basically, his price for being paid for other people was 30 shekels of silver service.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's an interesting relationship. Other thoughts? Shirley?
In Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira wanted the attention of giving money, but they weren't truthful about it.
Right.
I think their covetousness went way beyond just being, well, they lied to the Holy Spirit.
Right. And so in 3 cases, you see covetousness turns you into a liar, right? Seems a pretty tight relationship. Yeah. And I think, like Rocky was saying earlier, where you have this final commandment, like the last one, touches back on so many of the other things because this condition leads you to those other things. Rocky?
There's a lot of verses where it doesn't necessarily use the word covetous, but you can tell that it's talking about it. And one of them in the New Testament is John chapter 12, verse 43, where he's explaining why there were rulers that believed in Jesus, but they wouldn't confess him. And the reason is because they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Well, what was their desire? Their desire was to be pleasing to men instead of being pleasing to God. And if we think about that, there's a lot of covetousness that we see in our country today that's based solely on that. I mean, think about all of the garbage you see on social media, you know? I mean, why do they put up there how many likes there is and how many people have viewed this if it's not to feed people's covetousness to say, look at what I did and look at how many people saw that.
It's funny you said that because as you were saying it, my mind was social media influencer. Yeah, so
I'm 100% in agreement. You know, covetousness does involve, you know, having an inordinate desire for wealth and money and stuff like that. But that's just a part of it.
Sure.
I mean, there's a large part of it, and, you know, that's what you really need to think about. And so if we love God like we're supposed to, if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, where he talks about the love of God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and Jesus, when he listed what the 2 greatest commandments were, they're not even in the 10 commandments. You know, love God with all your heart, and then what? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's having the desires that God has. And if we truly love God, we will have his values. And if we have his values, we will desire the things that he desires.
and we will avoid the problems.
Yeah, and all these things that come under covetousness is having the wrong desires. So it all comes back to we're not valuing the right thing. Yeah. If we value what people think of us, we will do anything. We will preach whatever people want to hear. We will do whatever is the most outrageous thing to get the most likes on social media. And the whole society is just filled with that. And we got to be very, very careful we don't get caught up in that kind of stuff. Because it's
So that was an expansive answer to the next question. Why did God repeat this commandment in the New Testament?
Because it continues on today. I mean, God's nature hasn't changed. What was wrong, that concept was wrong from the beginning of time.
Because this is a diversion from doing his will, from focusing on him, right? So he's asking us to be his people, to do his things his way, right? And being greedy, and I would propose that the word covetousness is just a complicated way to spell greed, right? I did a little bit of word searching on the difference between the two, and it's almost a distinction without a difference between the two words. But right, so let's look at, well, why did he repeat this? I wrote that it's about the reliance on God, right? And we know that one's life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions, right? If we look at Luke 12, verse 15, and then we're going to skip to 20. And he said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. So I think that this is repeated to help us remember that we need to be seeking first the kingdom, right? And doing his will. But there's another element. Obviously, when we say we're Christians, that implies that we're making an effort to be Christ-like, right? So if we look at Colossians 3, it says, verse 1, sorry. If then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. So I think if we, look back at a lot of these events, Naboth's vineyard, David and Bathsheba, right? And it's the James progression of sin, right? Essentially, these folks have let their minds focus on that thing, whatever that thing might be, and they've stopped focusing on higher things. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. So it's just a complete opposite of that, and then that's where it's broken. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I apologize, Keith. The word catch-all kind of makes me feel like it's diminutive, right? So it's not really, we don't mean to demean the thing, but basically it's a broad warning against a root cause, right? We're attempting to deal with root cause. And that's, if you do like failure mode analysis or whatever, you always want to work your way back to the root cause of what it is, because if you only fix the symptoms, you're going to keep having the problems. So the Six Sigma stuff. The words that came to my mind is at the very last clause of Exodus 20:17 says, or anything that is your neighbor's. My HR wife would call that the general duty clause, right? So you have a very broad statement that prevents you from sliding out of it, right? All right, so essentially, I think what the point is to be content with what you have. So it's contentment, not covetous. If we look in Hebrews 13, verse 5, it says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear, what can man do to me? And then, I'm pretty sure this is Philippians chapter 4. And I say that because that's not how I would have abbreviated Philippians. But anyway, verse 11, not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So that's a very familiar verse, right? But I think the important part is that you're focusing on doing things through Christ, right? As opposed to through yourself. Robert?
Yeah, so if I can go back to Colossians.
Please.
In my head, I'm seeing a thread that we can pull through, and I would actually relate all of these three verses or passages you referenced back to when Paul asked that his affliction be removed 3 times, and finally God said, no, my grace is sufficient. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in a very succinct way is getting us to where you're trying to lead us in terms of our thought process. I look at Philippians 3, verse 3. where you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. That's a bottom line statement. And then he goes, then he sort of explains what that means.
What that means, yeah.
In terms of, in this case, don't covet, don't desire, these things. It's the same thing God was telling Paul. My grace is sufficient. First Peter chapter 1. The hope of your salvation is secure. We see it expressed in different ways, but it's the same core thought. Salvation is through God. That's where it stops, and that should be our concern.
And these are the characteristics that you should now exhibit if this is true, right? So. Yes, ma'am?
Peaceful and thankful lives. And envy steals your peace.
Okay, that's good. Envy steals your peace. And how is that? How does it do that?
And steal your peace.
So it becomes distracting, and then it becomes painful, right? Yeah.
It goes back to what you just read in Hebrews 13 about being content. If we're contented with what God has given us, then we'll be happy. But when we become discontent, we look for other ways of satisfying that. I mean, what did Satan do to Eve? He got her to be discontented by saying, there's something that you need to know, and God won't let you have it. We know we're supposed to be spiritual people. We're living in a physical world, and the society often gets into the church. Look at how many people stir up things to get people discontented because they make them look at, look, these people got more money than you got. They got more of this, they got more of that.
Yeah.
That's not right. You should have that too. So what does it do? It's always keeping people discontented about something, and then they go about solving that, oftentimes in wrong ways.
Yeah, let's hang on to that thought for just a second. So I was informed this morning the clock is a minute slow. So we got a minute less than it shows up there. So let's talk about that, Rocky. One of the questions I had, I like to kind of end with application for what we've looked at in the scriptures is, what steps can we take to prevent covetousness in our daily lives? And Rocky just hit on some of it. Tracy?
Is God going to give me what I need? I was just telling them in
Sure.
Peter, or 2 Peter, God will supply all I need for life and godliness. Well, if you have something and I don't, God doesn't need me to have it for whatever he needs me to do for life and for godliness. I may covet it and be envious of it, but that's not right. God is saying, I've got you. This is what you need to serve me. And we get in this mode of, well, maybe God's not going to give it to me. Or maybe I'm not going to have the things I need. And we lose that trust in him that he's going to provide whatever we need.
All right, so we start rushing things, trying to fix it, and then we see all these Old Testament examples of really horrible things happening when we do that. Yep. Yes, Keaton.
This is easier said than done, I'll preface that, but I think it circles back to what is our perspective long-term, right? I mean, do we truly, are we looking forward to heaven? Or are we more excited to be here, right? And again, that's easier said than done, and we all fall victim to it, but if heaven is that ultimate destination, where this is truly just a stop in the road, and that's where we're seeking to be, contentment and combating all the things we talked about this morning, I think, is easier, because we recognize that this is not the end-all be-all, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that we have a strive for just a terrible life while we're here, but we recognize this is not the end of it. We're going somewhere so much better. And I think that is probably the highest level combatant to, I want this, I want that. We recognize that all of it's going away. And where we're going is the ultimate destination. Again, easier said than done.
Yeah,
but
what's the teaching on that? That everything here is minor and insignificant relative to what you're going to get. So you have to keep it in perspective. Yeah. I'm here for a little while, and then I'm going on to much greater things, right?
Paul says everything I've lost is garbage. It's rubbish compared to knowing Christ. And the extension of knowing Christ is an eternity spent in heaven.
Yeah, and to die is gain, right? Right. So we have trust God and keep your eye on the prize, if you don't mind me making a cliche out of something pretty deep and important, right? I have some other thoughts about that. We are out of time. The things that I wrote down were avoid comparing ourselves to others. Rocky kind of mentioned that, look out and, hey, they got stuff you don't. Be grateful for what we have, right? Count your blessings. And give more, right? So turn that around and stop looking for the thing to come to you. And the more you're giving, the less you'll be concerned about what's coming to you. Yep. All right. Thank you very much. We'll wrap it up there.